Go. Right. Let's hide that. So, so last week we looked at one-point perspective, how to set up a quick one-point perspective grid, and hopefully you did hopefully you did 6 little one-point perspective sort of environment thumbnail sketches, just out of your own imagination. Just to recap that, let's just show you how we set that up. I'm just drawing a little frame here, and I'm going to use the line tool. I'm going to make very sure that it's set to pixels, not shape. Pixels, 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 right? And so we define our horizon line. It's a bit tiny, let's make it a bit bigger. Define our horizon line, we decide where our vanishing point is going to go, and then we sort of just do these kind of like radiating kind of lines, these not spirals, sort of like a star or something like that. And this will help us draw stuff that if you're thinking in CG, if you're thinking that's the y-axis going up, that's the x-axis going that way, the z-axis goes in. So this helps us draw our objects going in to the z-axis. But it's called one-point perspective because the only lines that are going to converge, meet at that vanishing point, are the ones going into that z-axis. The x, which is the horizontal, and the y kind of lines, they don't. They always remain parallel. It's a very unrealistic situation in a way. You'd have to be completely perpendicular to an object and looking at it for it to do that. And even then it wouldn't be technically right because your eyes have got slight distortion. But anyway, we set up a little grid like that. We tend to put our sort of painting layer underneath just so that grid always shows up. And I like to just lower the opacity a little bit because I don't like to be too distracted by it. And then it's a case of drawing in a kind of... By the way, remember, you can do this, you can totally do this with pen and paper, pencil and paper. In fact, in some ways, it's easier because, it's easier than I've got at the moment because I've either got to use the rotate tool in Photoshop, which is a little bit fiddly and goes like that and is a pain, or I've got to sort of go like this, whereas obviously you're doing it with a sketch pad and a pen, you can just rotate the paper. Anyway, or you can do all of this with pen and paper, you don't have to do it in Photoshop. So then I draw like a ground plane, like this. I'm going to try and suggest that there's some kind of, that it gets a bit lighter towards the horizon, just to simulate a little bit of atmospheric perspective, so to speak. And then the idea was, you draw a cube, or you begin to sort of just rough in where a cube or a block would go, and then you sort of ink over it and reinforce that perspective. So I go to a sort of completely black line, and now this is where I'm using the vanishing point, this perspective grid. So if I'm going to do the length of the cube going down this way, it's got to go like that. I'm going to make it easy for myself and literally draw it on where that perspective grid is. If you do it somewhere else, if you do it around here, well, you've got an option. You can either go back to your perspective grid and add another line in, or, and this is good practice, you can begin to estimate what those diagonals would be. So the vertical line goes straight down. Horizontal goes like this. And then here, I'm going to sort of estimate where that is, and sort of do something a bit like that maybe. Not the best, but you get the idea. And then you've got a choice of, if you wanted to, sort of suggesting there's a bit of light and shade on it if you want to do it in Photoshop. If you're doing this traditionally, you'd use a Copic marker pen to sort of do that. Gives you that nice sort of transparent feeling. So that's one-point perspective. That's where you're kind of looking at it in this kind of strangely artificial, straight-on viewpoint, and the only lines converging are the ones going into Z. It is artificial, but it's still really useful. When you're initially, say, designing an interior of a room, it's normally best to start at one-point perspective because you'll be able to show where everything lies within that room, and you won't have to worry about 2 sets of converging vanishing points. But what about 2-point perspective? Okay, I'm just going to turn off the sticky keys here because this is going to happen over and over again. Turn that off. What about two-point perspective? Okay, let's do a new one on a separate layer. Sort of define the frame, and we're going to define exactly the same sort of process to begin with. We're going to define our horizon line, like that. Going to define where one of our vanishing points is going to be. Let's say just there. I'm going to sort of draw out this. So far, it's exactly the same as one-point perspective. This is the easy bit in Photoshop. This is slightly harder, obviously, when you're doing it freehand. And I would encourage you to try and do it freehand rather than use a ruler. It just takes a bit of practice to do straight lines. So that's one vanishing point and one perspective grid. I'm going to create another one now. I'm just going to lower the opacity of this so I can see through it a little bit. Now, I don't need to draw the horizon line again because the horizon line stays the same regardless of whether it's 1 or 2 or even 3-point perspective. But I'm going to draw now a new vanishing point. So the new vanishing point is going to go on the other side of the image. And that's where the new vanishing point is. So now I do this. This is a 2-point perspective grid now because it's got 2 vanishing points and 2 sets of perspective lines. Again, I'm going to lower the opacity of that so I can just see through it. And I'm going to paint a very, very similar thing. So I'm going to select that, sort of block in a rough ground plane. Just use the same values that I chose just here. So it looks roughly the same. Like that, that'll do. I'm not interested in creating a pretty image at the moment. So now let's draw the same kind of cube. So I'm going to block it in, sort of roughly in the middle, just here. But this time I'm going to kind of pay attention to what the vanishing points are doing on this side and this side. Exactly the same kind of process. Just block in a mask, like block in some value, so to speak. Shrink my brush down. Go to black and then kind of ink in and show what's happened. So I'm going to make my life easy. I'm going to use the lines where my perspective grids kind of coincide or cross over or intersect, so to speak. So I'm going to draw one like that. Gets a little bit trickier here. Now I've got to really estimate what's going on. You know what? I'm going to make it super easy for myself because I'm in Photoshop. I might as well. I'm going to go back into that perspective layer and I'm going to sort of give myself a couple of extra perspective line grids, just to make it easier for myself. Why make things harder? Okay, so back here, this is going to go like that, and then this is going to trace like that with a really rubbish wobbly freehand. And then I'm going to do that thing where I effectively sort of give a hint, a tiny little bit of lighting on this side. So that's a 2-point perspective grid. So what has essentially sort of happened here? In some ways, it's the same cube, exactly the same setup. What has happened by using a 2-point perspective grid, I've done one of 2 things. I've either moved my entire point of view around that cube a little bit, or I've taken that cube and I've rotated it. It's kind of the same object, but now it's rotated. And this is what being able to convert between 1 and 2-point and eventually 3-point perspective is going to allow you to do. It's going to allow you to take a design, it's going to allow you to rotate it mentally and on the page in 3D space. Okay? So what I want you to do now is have a go at that. I want you to create a 2-point perspective grid and start drawing a bunch of little cubes that are that look like they're rotated in 3D space, okay? But only along there, well, as you can see here, by doing the 2 vanishing points on the same horizon line here, it's like I've rotated it in Y, if we're talking CG, okay? And I'll give you, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes to just have a little play with that, just have a go. So that's really, really simple 2-point perspective kind of grid, and the difference between a 1-point and a 2-point perspective grid. Let's hide the 1-point perspective grid for now, because we don't need that. Now, I did touch on this last semester during the kind of the lecture part of it. When you're doing a 2-point perspective grid, you now run into the issue of distortion happening. At the moment, if you look at these cubes, I mean, they kind of look 3D, but they look really, really kind of distorted. Like the angles start getting really severe here, especially the further towards the edges of the frame you get. Why is this kind of happening? It's happening because the two vanishing points that we defined are both in the frame. Now, the closer these two vanishing points get to each other, the more and more distorted it's going to look. It's going to essentially look like an extreme wide-angle lens. It's not going to look like a fisheye lens, because that's a slightly different thing, and you'd get curved distortion happening. But it's going to be similar, actually, if you go into Maya and you adjust the field of view of the Maya camera to an extremely low value. You're going to get cubes and objects that look severely distorted. So how do you get around that? Well, you move the vanishing points away from each other. But you go kind of further than that, because you move... Is everyone listening? Right? You move the vanishing points so that one vanishing point is in the frame and another vanishing point is actually off of the entire frame. Let me show you how you can tackle that. So initially, same thing. So define your horizon line, define one vanishing point, and start doing this. Exactly the same as before. Now let's do the other one. So I'm going to do it on another layer. This is where it's going to get a bit trickier in a way. You're going to have to use some estimation. Now, there are technical ways, highly technical, well, not highly technical ways, there are technical ways of really accurately determining where a second vanishing point off the frame goes. And we are going to cover that. But for the purposes of today's session, and for a little while yet, when we're just still getting to grips with this and sketching, we're going to estimate where the second vanishing point is. So we're going to start that off by defining the kind of general feeling of this angle, of this second vanishing point. So I'm going to draw a line like this. So you can imagine the vanishing point here is going to be way over here, maybe even off the entire screen. So how do you then put the second vanishing point in? The second perspective line in. You've got to start now looking at that angle, the horizon line, and kind of estimating what that sort of intermediate angle is going to be. Maybe something like that. Then you've got to look at this angle, the horizon line, and below it. And you've got to go, okay, I think it maybe goes about there. Once you've done a couple, you can start, it becomes easier to add in the rest, because you can begin to see, you can begin to almost sense this kind of star kind of pattern, this radiating pattern. So you can go like that, maybe go like this, and then when you want to put them in between, it becomes even easier, because it becomes a lot easier to just estimate what those angles are going to be, because the angles are going to be much closer to each other. So now when you draw, I'm just going to reinforce this horizon line. Now when you draw a cube, it's not going to feel quite as distorted as it does at the moment, as it does when you've got the vanishing points both on the page. So let's try that. I'm going to lower the opacity of that, create a new layer, and sort of do the same thing again. I'm just going to sort of block in a rough kind of ground plane. This, and let's draw, let's just sort of block in something that's sitting just about here, maybe. Like that, and now I'm going to reinforce that with sort of an inkish kind of line. dark line. Something like that. So the angles become less severe because this vanishing point is miles away over here, and by the time that the perspective grid has come all the way and come into our frame, those angles are more sort of, they're closer to being parallel to each other. Now, the further you move apart these vanishing points, the less distortion there happens. So you can start moving, you can even move this vanishing point over here. You can start estimating those kind of lines. What I want you to try now then is do what you just did before, but this time put one vanishing point outside of the frame. So you're going to have to start estimating those lines. And this time, instead of cubes, feel free to, I don't know, actually sort of design little buildings or something like that, okay? Yeah, Amy?
Can we use a trick in Photoshop to make...
like the star thing?
Yes.
You can, in inverted quotes, but not for this exercise just here. So yeah, I want to see, this time, actually design little buildings. Just little cubey buildings. Don't go over the top. This isn't an exercise about design at the moment. This is just an exercise in getting, hopefully, super comfortable with drawing in perspective. Okay, I'm recording. Good. I want to show you maybe one of the most powerful tools in perspective drawing. And that is the ability to accurately repeat the same sized plane in perspective going into the distance. For example, I mean, look when I was doing this one, and I wasn't using this method, trying to guess the right kind of size of these kind of, I don't know what they are, windows on the factory, or whatever it is like that. What if you could define one window, or one door, or one plane, or one whatever, and then have a way of almost automatically repeating that into perspective, whether it's in that way towards that vanishing point, or that way towards that vanishing point. Well, there's a very straightforward, cool little way of doing that. Let's just hide these, and I'll show you. So, to begin with, again, I'm going to create a quick perspective grid. Actually, this time, I might try doing it this way. You can go into Polygon tool, which is where your line is, and you can put sides 99, and you can go to the little cogwheel sign, and you can say, give me a star, and indent the sides by 99%, like this. So then when you draw out something, you'll get like super quick, lots and lots and lots of perspective lines. So I'm going to do it this kind of way. So first of all, I'm going to decide that my vanishing point is just there. And if you hold down Shift, that will also sort of snap it and lock it, so you'll get a horizon line as well. Now, obviously you get a fairly dense center vanishing point, but, you know, that's all right. I don't really care about that. I'm just going to duplicate the whole thing and then move it across. Actually, no, I'm going to select it and I'm going to flip it like that to give me my other kind of vanishing point, and then sort of move it off. And also do this, so I get a much more sort of shallow convergence going on. Okay, that'll do, like that. And let's just delete what I don't need. Like that. And I'm going to collapse these two layers into one and lower their opacity so I can see what I'm doing. Now I'll have to zoom in to show you this bit. And actually, you know what I'll do? I'll just reinforce that horizon line, which I'll put about there. This. Okay, right. On a new layer. Let's first of all define a plane. And we're just going to use the line tool for this, so it's just a bit quicker. So I'm going to draw a plane. I'm going to say the plane is like this. And this is going to be my first plane. Now, this plane, it can either literally be a rectangle of some kind, or you could draw a feature in here. It could even be a curved feature. And you could draw a plane around that curved feature that acts as a kind of bounding box. So this is how you can repeat certain kind of complicated patterns. So to repeat this, to get this receding off into this kind of direction, you've got to do a couple of things. You've got to find the dead center of this plane. This is actually where it becomes maybe a bit easier when you're sketching it, because you can sketch very, very lightly. But the same theory applies. So to find the dead center of this plane, even though it's in perspective, you have to draw a line from one corner to the other, like this, and then another line from that corner to that. Now where they cross over, that is the geometric center of that plane. I'm going to extend these lines off towards the vanishing point, like this. And now I'm going to draw a line that connects the dead center and heads off towards the vanishing point where these converge. Now I'm fairly close to a perspective guideline here, so I can kind of eyeball it. I mean, obviously, the more accurate you are, the better. But you only need to be mostly accurate for it to almost look like magic, like you're some kind of incredible savant who can just draw perfectly in perspective. So this line stretches off here. Now what you need to do is draw a line that goes from the top corner here, or it can also go from the bottom corner. And it's got to cross, not through this one, but through this line just here, and it's got to keep on going like that. Now where it touches this line, you draw a new vertical. And now, this plane here, I'll draw it in a different colour. This plane is exactly the same size as this plane, except it's been moved and it's been repositioned in perspective slightly. Now you can do it again. You can just do this over and over again. So what I'll do is, this time, you don't need to draw a new centre line. You don't need to determine the centre of this one, because you've already got this kind of line going. So now I can draw a line that goes through there, crosses through that line, and that's where the new one is. You can keep on going. You notice how each one, sort of on the page, on the canvas, gets a little bit skinnier because it's gradually heading towards this horizon line. This has got to be one of the most powerful techniques in perspective drawing, because not only does it allow you to draw repeating shapes that disappear off into perspective, it also allows you to transfer features from one image onto a new perspective grid. The best example I can think of, let's just go over to Google, is say, let's find, I don't know, office block. Yeah, perfect. This will do. You can look at this picture here and you can go, well, obviously I know that that window, and that window are the same size as each other. This one probably is as well, but it's partially obscured by this bit here. So this would allow you to draw this in perspective. You can define one window, and now you can repeat it exactly and draw this entire building, but in a completely different perspective, but keep its proportions, because you know one feature and you know that it repeats 1, 2, 3, 4 times here. So now you can draw a new block, a new cube of a building by defining one window and then using this replication technique to repeat it X amount of times. And you can do exactly the same in this axis as well, and I'll sort of show you. So let's define a much kind of skinnier looking sort of sliver. So bring it up here. Go just there. Now I'm going to delete this bit here. And now I can go, okay, right. The center of this plane is just here. First of all, let's just extend these vanishing points down and up. So the center is just here, and it handily lies exactly on my little vanishing point, my little perspective guide, so I can sort of move this down. And now again, I'm going to draw from this corner through there until it touches here, and that is where the new plane is going to go. And I can keep on doing it. So as you'll notice, each time you do it, it gets a little bit skinnier until it's going to get so foreshortened it's going to be like a sliver. Right, before the final task, I want you all to have a go at this. Just draw a bunch of planes and start replicating them in space, okay? I would just use, if I was you, for now, unless you're doing this pencil and paper or pen and paper, I would just use the line tool to make life a bit easier. You could use the mouse then, and it's not going to, your fingers are going to get a rest, you know. Right, just to show you, just as a little reminder. So you've built this up. Say you're doing a building, and so far you've been doing mostly, obviously very, very blocky, cubey-looking buildings. Well, you can do this as what we call like an underlay or an overlay as a preparation for drawing something more ambitious. Let's just reduce this. Now this can act as a guide. It's going to move down to black. So you could draw, you know, something curved like this. And now you've got these guides, so you know how big or how to draw the rest of them. And so they're going to feel you're going to be able to draw sort of curved like this. Now we're going to get into more detailed how to transfer curves really accurately in perspective later. But again, this is going to let you draw much more ambitious kind of stuff now that you know how to replicate and foreshorten stuff in perspective without using rulers or anything like that, okay?